There's a fortress at the edge of the Black Sea that Russia has spent 12 years turning into the most heavily armed peninsula on Earth. Crimea. Underground bunkers, S-400 air defense batteries, a naval fleet that once projected Russian power across the entire Black Sea basin. A bridge stretching nearly 19 kilometers across the Kerch Strait, the longest in Europe, the physical lifeline connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. Putin's most prized military asset, the crown jewel of everything he calls Russian greatness. And right now, piece by piece, system by system, supply line by supply line, Ukraine is methodically destroying every single one of them. This is not a future plan. This is not a military theory being debated in staff colleges. This is an active, ongoing campaign that has already entered its second phase. The Black Sea Fleet has been driven from Sevastopol. A third of it has been destroyed. Railway ferries have been hit. Oil depots are burning monthly. Air defense radars are going dark, one by one. Airports across the peninsula are being systematically rendered inoperable. And now, something has changed that changes everything else. On April 13, 2026, the political obstacle that had been blocking 90 billion euros in European funding for Ukraine's war effort vanished overnight. The money is coming. The weapons it will buy are already on the list. And retired U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who has been saying since the beginning of this war that Crimea can be reclaimed, is now saying that the timeline is tightening dramatically. The siege of Crimea has begun. Not with a frontal assault, not with thousands of soldiers charging across open ground into fortified Russian positions. With something far more patient, far more precise, and far more devastating. With a strategy that is already working. And when it reaches its conclusion, the consequences will extend far beyond a map changing in Eastern Europe. They will reshape the Black Sea, European energy security, the international order, and the future of Vladimir Putin's regime. This is the story of how Ukraine plans to take Crimea back, and why it might actually succeed. To understand what is happening right now, you need to understand why Crimea matters to this war in a way that goes beyond symbolic significance. Crimea is not simply a piece of land Russia annexed in 2014. It is the operational backbone of everything Russia has done militarily in Ukraine's south. The peninsula stretches deep into the Black Sea and borders the Sea of Azov on one side, giving whoever controls it the ability to project naval and air power across a massive swath of regional geography. Its ports, particularly Sevastopol, provided Russia with the logistical infrastructure that sustained all operations on the southern front from day one of the full-scale invasion. Ukraine's President Zelensky stated in 2022 that Crimea holds the key to ending this war. That assessment was not rhetorical. It was strategic. As long as Russia controls Crimea, it has a fortified, deeply embedded southern base from which it can threaten Ukraine's coastline, disrupt commercial shipping in the Black Sea, and sustain military pressure across the entire southern sector of the front. Take Crimea away, and Russia loses all of that simultaneously. The Black Sea Fleet loses its primary base. Southern logistics collapse. The strategic depth Russia relies on disappears. And Putin loses the single greatest trophy of his political career, the 12-year-old victory myth that has sustained his domestic legitimacy through every setback this war has produced. This is why Ukraine's military, intelligence, and political leadership have kept Crimea at the top of their strategic priority list, even during the darkest periods of this conflict. And this is why the campaign now underway is the most consequential military operation Ukraine has attempted since the war began. But here is what most people still do not understand about how Ukraine intends to do it. The conventional assumption about retaking Crimea involves images of massive armored columns crossing into the peninsula, assault forces breaching fortified Russian defensive lines, and the kind of frontal military engagement that would produce tens of thousands of casualties on both sides before the outcome was decided. Retired U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges flatly rejects that picture. Hodges has been one of the clearest strategic voices on this conflict since 2022. His framework for understanding how Crimea can be reclaimed is built around a single core insight. You do not need to defeat the garrison defending Crimea in direct combat. You need to isolate it, degrade it, and exhaust it until it collapses from within. Then a final operation becomes possible with far fewer losses than a frontal assault would ever require. His logic is drawn from one of the most consistent lessons of military history. The Russian military is not a nimble, adaptive fighting force. It is a large, cumbersome, logistics-dependent structure inherited from Soviet doctrine. Its defensive strength depends entirely on the continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, reinforcements, and command coordination. Cut off those flows, and tanks become stationary metal. Artillery becomes silent. A defensive line becomes a collection of isolated, demoralized, increasingly desperate garrisons waiting for supplies that will never come. Destroy the logistics that sustain the enemy's defensive capability, and the defense collapses on its own. Ukraine has been executing this strategy for 3 years. What is happening now is not the beginning of a campaign. It is the acceleration of one that has already produced irreversible results. The campaign against Crimea operates on 3 distinct fronts simultaneously. Understanding all 3 is essential to understanding why the current moment is so significant. The first front is the sea. At the beginning of 2022, Russia's Black Sea Fleet operated from Sevastopol with complete confidence, launching cruise missile strikes against Ukrainian cities and coastline, blockading Ukrainian ports, and projecting Russian naval power across the entire region. That fleet was the most visible symbol of what Russian control of Crimea actually meant in military terms. 3 years later, the picture has completely reversed. Ukraine's asymmetric naval campaign, combining Magura V-5 naval drones, Neptune anti-ship missiles, and Storm Shadow cruise missiles, has destroyed approximately 1/3 of the Black Sea Fleet. The ships that survived were forced to flee Sevastopol and take refuge in Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland. But even that refuge is no longer safe. Drone attacks against frigates continued into April 2026, demonstrating that Ukraine's naval reach extends wherever Russia attempts to shelter its remaining vessels. The Black Sea Fleet has not been defeated in a traditional naval engagement. It has been made irrelevant through persistent, creative, asymmetric warfare that Russia had no effective answer for. The second front is the bridge. The Kerch Bridge is not just an infrastructure asset. It is the physical embodiment of Putin's claim over Crimea. He personally opened it with enormous ceremony. It was the symbol of permanence, of Crimea's integration into Russia being not just political, but physically and structurally cemented. Ukraine has been targeting the Kerch Bridge methodically for years. Structural damage from previous strikes has already affected its capacity. Drone alerts close it repeatedly, disrupting the flow of military supplies to the peninsula and forcing Russia to reroute logistics through the longer, more vulnerable land routes running through the Donbas. Every closure, every alert, every forced rerouting degrades the speed and reliability of Russian resupply to Crimea. Hodges is direct about where this trajectory leads. If the Ukrainians were able to isolate the peninsula, that big bridge is eventually going to come down. The question is no longer whether the bridge can be struck effectively. Ukraine has already demonstrated it can. The question is when the cumulative damage and operational pressure reach the point of no return. The third front is the land corridor. The Zaporizhia-Melitopol land route and the supply lines running through the Donbas represent Russia's alternative to bridge-based logistics. Ukraine is keeping these corridors under constant pressure with HIMARS and ATACMS missiles, striking fuel depots, ammunition storage facilities, and the command infrastructure that coordinates resupply operations. Every successful strike on this corridor means less fuel, less ammunition, and fewer reinforcements reaching Russian forces in Crimea. When these 3 dimensions work together, the peninsula stops being a Russian military base connected to the mainland. It becomes a besieged piece of land that is being forced to sustain itself on diminishing reserves under constant aerial threat with no reliable path for reinforcement. Inside Crimea itself, the systematic dismantling of Russian military infrastructure is already well advanced. The airports are collapsing one by one. Saki, Belbek, and Kirovskoy have been struck repeatedly. Fuel storage for aircraft operations has been destroyed. Runways have been damaged. The air power that Russia positioned in Crimea to threaten Ukrainian cities and support Southern Front operations is increasingly grounded. Not because the aircraft were all destroyed, but because the infrastructure required to operate them no longer reliably functions. Oil depots across the peninsula are burning monthly. Every fire at a fuel storage facility represents a direct degradation of Russian military mobility in Crimea. Tanks need fuel. Artillery pieces need to be repositioned by vehicles that need fuel. When fuel supplies are interdicted at the storage level before they can even be distributed to frontline units, The entire operational tempo of Russian forces in Crimea slows, then stalls. Air defense radars are being systematically blinded. S-400 and Pantsir batteries have been destroyed in targeted strikes. The recent Ukrainian attacks on Nebo radar installations represent what military analysts are describing as the first concrete steps in a deliberate campaign to suppress Russian air defenses over Crimea entirely. When those defenses go dark, Crimea's skies become accessible in ways they are not today, and the final phase of Ukraine's campaign becomes operationally viable. Command centers have been struck by Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles. Ammunition depots have been destroyed in the explosions that have become a recurring feature of Ukrainian strikes deep inside the peninsula. The chain of command that coordinates Russian military operations in Crimea is fracturing under this persistent pressure. Hodges captures the result with precision. The Russian garrison in Crimea is rotting from within, without a single soldier crossing the Ukrainian border. Morale is falling. Logistics are degrading. Command coordination is fracturing. All of it happening from a distance through precision strikes without the frontal assault that conventional military thinking would assume is necessary. Now, here is the development that changed the timeline. Everything described above requires weapons, long-range precision munitions, naval drones, cruise missiles, electronic warfare systems. All of it costs money, and for months, the single largest pool of money designated to fund Ukraine's continued war effort was frozen by a political veto. Hungary's Viktor Orbán had been blocking the €90 billion EU loan package for Ukraine, a package with €60 billion allocated for military procurement and €30 billion for budgetary support. His obstruction had become one of the most consequential political bottlenecks of the entire war. On April 13, 2026, the bottleneck dissolved. The TISA party led by Peter Magyar secured a landslide election victory in Hungary. Orbán conceded. The new Hungarian government has announced full support for EU integration and will lift the veto on the €90 billion package. The timing could not be more strategically significant. As American attention and resources shift toward the Middle East and the ongoing crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, Europe is being asked to carry more of the burden of supporting Ukraine. The €90 billion package arriving at this moment is not just financial support. It is a signal that the European commitment to Ukraine's war effort is deepening rather than wavering. For Crimea specifically, the implications are direct. Hodges had stated clearly that additional weapons deliveries from the West could complete the isolation phase by the end of summer. The money to buy those weapons just arrived. The weapons themselves are not abstract items on a procurement wish list. They are specific systems whose operational roles in the Crimea campaign are already understood. ATACMS missiles, with ranges of up to 300 kilometers, cover every significant target in Crimea from Ukrainian-controlled territory. Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles are critical for the most heavily fortified targets, including the Kerch Bridge and the deepest bunkers around Sevastopol. Ukraine's indigenous long-range drones are already operating at scale. The FP-1, FP-2, and FP-5 Flamingo systems are conducting thousands of monthly sorties against oil infrastructure and military installations across the peninsula. Magura V-5 naval drones, the weapons that drove the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, continue to evolve in capability with each operational generation. F-16 fighter jets, now in Ukrainian service, will become increasingly critical as the campaign against Russian air defenses in Crimea intensifies. The one major Western system still absent from Ukraine's arsenal that Hodges and other analysts consider potentially decisive is the German Taurus missile. Its specific capabilities for deep penetration strikes against hardened targets make it ideally suited for the final phase of the Crimea campaign. The strategic implications of what happens if Ukraine succeeds go far beyond the military dimension. They reshape the entire geopolitical architecture of the region. Crimea's ports, Sevastopol, Yevpatoria, Feodosia, were major transit points for Ukrainian grain and metal exports before 2014. Their return to Ukrainian control would restore shipping routes that have been disrupted for over a decade. Marine insurance costs in the Black Sea would fall as the threat environment changes. Ukraine's annual export revenue would increase by billions of dollars as trade normalizes. The Black Sea continental shelf surrounding Crimea contains significant natural gas reserves that were in active exploration before Russia's 2014 annexation froze the projects. Returning Crimea to Ukrainian control means those reserves re-enter the development pipeline. For Europe that has spent 3 years searching for alternatives to Russian energy, a new Ukrainian gas source accessing Black Sea reserves is strategically transformative. A Black Sea fleet without Sevastopol is reduced to a diminished force confined to Novorossiysk with dramatically reduced range and capability. The threat it poses to Turkey's southern approaches, to Romania, to Bulgaria, and to NATO's southern maritime security drops to a fraction of its current level. The Black Sea becomes what it should always have been, a zone of commercial trade rather than a theater of Russian power projection. Territory seized by force can be reclaimed. That message is directed at Russia, but it is heard in Beijing, where territorial claims over Taiwan and the South China Sea define long-term strategic ambitions. It is heard in every capital, where a revisionist power is watching the outcome of this war to calculate whether the international order will hold or bend. Inside Russia, the impact would be something else entirely. Putin's domestic legitimacy has been constructed around a small number of foundational narratives. Crimea is ours became the slogan that defined an era of Russian politics. Losing Crimea does not just reverse a military defeat, it demolishes that foundational narrative. The 12-year-old victory myth that has sustained Putin through every setback shatters. If Russia can no longer export oil and gas and loses Crimea, the pressure on the oligarchs will intensify, and when the oligarchs feel that pressure, the circle of loyalty around Putin faces its most serious test. Ukrainian intelligence chief Budanov has assessed that Russia is already looking for a way out. Losing Crimea accelerates that calculation dramatically. Here is where everything stands right now. Ukraine has already completed the first phase of the campaign against Crimea. The second phase is now underway. The isolation campaign is intensifying. With the €90 billion European package unlocked, with Ukrainian drone production at industrial scale, and Western weapons deliveries continuing, the resources required to complete the second phase and begin the third are arriving. Hodges gave a timeline. Additional Western weapons deliveries could complete the isolation phase by the end of summer. If the weapons arrive and the campaign sustains its current momentum, the question of Crimea's future will look fundamentally different before the year is out. None of this is guaranteed. War never is. But the direction of this campaign is clear. The foundation of Russian control over Crimea is eroding. The infrastructure supporting its military value is being dismantled. The funding that will accelerate that dismantling has just arrived. Zelensky said, "Crimea holds the key to ending this war." Ukraine is now turning that key. The siege has begun. The second phase is active. And based on everything unfolding right now, the chapter that follows will determine not just the outcome of this war, but the shape of the international order for a generation. Do not look away.